Our reading this morning is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." And the teachers of the law, who came down from Jerusalem, said, "He is possessed by Beelzebub. By the prince of demons he is driving out demons." So Jesus called them and spoke to them in parables. "How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. In fact, no one can enter a strong man's house and carry off his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man. Then he can rob his house. I tell you the truth, all the sins and blasphemies of men will be forgiven them. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. He's guilty of an eternal sin." He said this because they were saying he has an evil spirit. Then Jesus' mother and brother arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him, and they told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." "Who are my mother and brothers?" he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother."
Today's reading challenges us to try to understand what Jesus is saying about family ties and what the religious leaders of his day were saying about evil. Well, let's take evil first. It's never a nice subject to deal with, but in today's gospel, Jesus is being charged with being in league with evil spirits, so we can't avoid it, even if we would like to. One of the unfortunate aspects of life is that the power to do good brings with it a corresponding ability or power to do evil. The meaning of evil given by Macquarie is anything which causes injury or harm. And we all know that power can fall victim to oppression. Love can fall into the power of possessiveness, goodness to legalism, and success to vanity. The gospel, however, informs us that the power to do good is very real, while the power to do evil can be overcome. We need to remember that the religious leaders of Jesus' day were trying to help the people live within the power of the law. They were trying to make sure that all actions were good and productive and pleasing to God. That was the aim. That was the intention. But unfortunately, the Pharisees' increasing reverence for the law had started to place it above the power of the people, so that in the end it led to a lessening of their respect for the human person as someone created in God's image. What became far more important was obeying the very letter of the law. As custodians of the law, the Pharisees' power began to increase. They were the ones with the knowledge. They were the ones who knew what was right and wrong, and it was their job to make sure people understood that. But in doing that, in living out what was their God-given gift, what had happened was, as their power increased, the people's power decreased into powerlessness. Jesus comes along and challenges not only the Pharisees' power with his words, but with his deeds. And as we heard a little earlier on, that started to create problems. Here was someone who was challenging not only the Jewish law and way of doing things, but also the Roman law. No wonder his parents, his mother, his brother, his sisters would have been concerned about what's going on. No wonder they thought he was out of his mind. So on this Sabbath day, in the part of the reading just before we hear the stuff today, a man with a withered arm longs to touch Jesus, to experience healing, to find wholeness in his life. For so long he has found himself on the outside edge because he's not perfect. And the law required that you had to do certain things in order to be pure. And if you were obviously physically not pure, you weren't included. You found yourself excluded from all things. So this man with a withered arm longed to touch Jesus and experienced healing. So Jesus asked him to come up, stand up in front of everyone in the synagogue. And then he asked the Pharisees, what was it lawful to do on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? Well, Jesus was deeply distressed when they said nothing, because they found themselves in a dilemma. They didn't know how to answer. So Jesus grabbed the man's dangling, useless fingers, pulled his arm till it filled his sleeve, and became whole and useful once more. The very fact that the Jewish authorities remained silent shows how much they had deviated from what God's will was. God's will was healing, wholeness, justice. There's a lovely Jewish word for it. That word, shalom. Shalom. Much more than the word peace that we often interpret it for. It's about healing and wholeness and justice for all. That incident is at the very beginning of the chapter from which our gospel reading comes today. It helps to explain the hostility shown towards Jesus, especially from the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem. We wonder sometimes why people can't understand or discern God's will for the world or for themselves. And yet here we have Jesus in person demonstrating God's way of love is not always one that will be welcomed. God's way of love actually threatened the power base of the Pharisees, and they could not or would not see the good that was being enacted on other people's lives because it happened at the wrong time. Here was God's love occurring out of context, in the wrong place. There were 6 other days of the week where that could happen, but not on the Sabbath. It wasn't that long ago that people from a Methodist tradition would probably remember there were so many things that didn't happen on a Sabbath. That the idea of spending time in God's presence and reflecting on God's shalom could end up becoming a law that was so rigid it stopped you from enjoying the fullness of life. If ever there was a verse that challenged that, it was here. It seems too that even Jesus' own family were blind to this God-given power. Jesus' question might sound strange to our ears, even callous and unfeeling. When he's told that his mother and brothers are outside, worried about him, thinking he's out of his mind, wondering what's going on, instead of instantly turning to them and listening, he says, "Who is my mother? Who is my brothers?" Think about that for a moment, especially in Jesus' day, where honour of parents is tantamount to the greatest thing that you could ever do. Here he is challenging that by saying, "Who's my mother? Who's my brothers?" He's being told that they're worried about him. And Jesus says basically that any blood relationship is of little consequence when compared to the relationship that grows out of seeing God's love lived out and acted around him. As Jesus then looks at those seated around him, no doubt with jaws hitting the floor, he says, "Here is my mother. Here is my brother. Here are my sisters. Whoever does the will of God is my brother, my sister, my mother." Jesus shares our humanity to show that God is not a distant God, not some God enshrined in legalism, but rather a God who embraces the hurt and suffering people of our world. Ours is a God who embraces our hurt, our suffering, and calls us into family. There's a little beautiful story about a little girl who was late home from running an errand. Her parents were really worried about why she was so late. And when she got home, they were distraught and said to her, "Where have you been? What's going on? You were meant to be home. You only went down the shop to get some bread. It's been half an hour." But the little girl explained that on the way, she came across a friend who had dropped her favourite china doll, and it had smashed to pieces on the ground. "Oh," her dad says, "so you helped her to pick up the pieces?" "No," said the child. "I stopped to help her cry. I stopped to help her cry." Through Jesus, God stops to help the world cry, to share the pain of the world, to demonstrate that evil does not have the last word. And Jesus says to us, "Whoever does the will of God is my brother, my sister, my mother." And we see on our TVs every night the struggle between good and evil, the struggle of oppressed people for freedom, the starving people seeking just for a meal, something to keep them going, of landless people searching for a place to call their own. We see young girls culturally abused and tortured, crying out for freedom, or lonely and distressed people seeking just an act of kindness, a word of hope. So who are my brothers, my sisters, my mother? This, we all know, is a world of contradictions. We are all part of it. What help is the gospel in our confusing and conflicting times? How do we go about addressing the evil that can corrupt and pollute our society or our environment or our world? Well, the gospel has meaning. It has meaning to those who believe that following the way of Jesus injects into our world a new stream of life and hope. The gospel has meaning. Meaning for those who are willing to stake their lives and declare themselves fools for Christ's sake and for the gospel. The gospel has meaning. It has meaning for those who dare to be different, to stand out from the crowd, to be signs of life, sparks of light, especially in the midst of the shadows of uncertainty and fear which can threaten and overwhelm so many. The gospel, I believe, has meaning for those who are prepared to give of themselves without counting the cost. So where are we? You and me in all of this. Are we open to hearing Jesus' call to us personally and as a community of faith? Are we prepared to risk to follow where he might lead? Who is my brother, my sister? Asked Jesus. He looks around and says, "Here are my brothers, my sisters, my mother." Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister. Let those who have ears hear.